Happy Halloween! Today we'll be looking at the last of 3 stories from the collection H.P. Lovecraft's The Hound and Other Stories by Nameless. The Nameless City is a short story written by H.P. Lovecraft in 1921, and the publication history is a little interesting. Weird Tales, the magazine that purchased and published most of Lovecraft's stories, rejected it twice, and it was first published by an amateur press journal called The Wolverine in November 1921. It would ultimately be republished in Weird Tales in 1938 after Lovecraft's death. Unlike a lot of his stories, Lovecraft actually liked how this one turned out, and it is generally considered the first Cthulhu mythos story. The Temple, which I made a video about earlier this month, was written earlier, but it isn't usually considered part of the Cthulhu mythos. Let's get right into it. Our story takes us to the sands of the Arabian Peninsula as a Western explorer, our narrator, recounts his journey to a crumbling and nameless city. He had read of it in the Necronomicon, where it says the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred dreamt of it before he sang a now famous couplet. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die. A note here, I mentioned in my video about The Hound that it was that story which first featured the Necronomicon. That is true, and it was written after this one. Lovecraft's original story here quotes Abdul al-Hazred, and is the first mention of him in Lovecraft's work, but does not actually name the Necronomicon. An ominous wind blows across the sand, filling the explorer with dread as he approaches the wind-worn ruins of an ancient city carved into the rock. As he gazes at its shadowed architecture under the moonlight, he believes that this is the city of myth he has been looking for. A city that was ancient before the first stones of Memphis were laid and the bricks of Babylon had been baked. It is a city never given a name, with no hint of its prosperity remaining. All the tribes of Arabia shun it without wholly knowing why. He cannot find any outer sign of who its inhabitants were, but he does come across a carved opening in the rock. The explorer feels as if the yawning temple entrance is looking at him. Somehow, a strange cold wind seems to be originating from the opening. He resolves to wait for the wind to abate, and then explore the ancient temple. With a torch to light his way, the explorer crawls into the low cave. He does find the low ceiling strange, and speculates that this was a place of some ceremonial significance rather than a living space. The explorer finds a carved passage of steeply descending stairs in the back of the chamber. After descending them for 5 hours, he is deposited into another large chamber. To his surprise, the torch went out at some point along the way. A strange, dim phosphorescence lights the chamber, seemingly originating from another low aperture at the far end. He can't see very well, so he feels his way across the room. There are rows of finely polished wooden cases, with thick glass tops stretching along the space. It seems unlikely that they should have survived all these ages in such a pristine condition. They also strike him as being rather like coffins. Within them, he finds the likeness of a bizarre creature, enrobed in elaborate attire, covered with precious metals and gems. The explorer dismisses the idea that these could have been some ancient creature from when the Nameless City had been alive. They cannot be real. They must be some sort of idol or object of worship for the people of this ancient city. Moving deeper, the explorer comes to a room covered in frescoes and carvings apparently describing the history of the city. However, most of the figures are those strange idols from before. The explorer supposes that they were to the residents of the city as wolves were to the Romans, or totem poles to the Native Americans. They are figures of myth or religious significance, perhaps also serving as an emblem of the civilization itself. He finds there are humans in the art after all, however. As the sequence of ages portrayed in the frescoes goes on, the creatures and their city begin to wither away until only their phantoms loom over the ruined city. In the final image, a group of dying priests of the creatures slaughter a band of primitive humans attacking the city. The explorer remembers how the Arab tribes fear the Nameless city. Turning away, there is yet another opening at the end of the room, with an even brighter light. Beyond it, he sees another flight of small stairs, much like those he already traversed. Swung open on the other side of the opening was a massive pair of thick brass doors, and below, the staircase disappeared into a swirling mist. A uniform light came from it as if in overcast sky. Only a few feet of the stairs were visible above the glowing vapors. The explorer is struck by the bizarre sensation that, rather than being in a vault beneath the earth, he stands at the summit of Mount Everest. As he steps down towards the vapor, he realizes that it isn't truly mist or cloud, but an essence of primal hatred and hostility. A shape forms from it, and suddenly the explorer starts to understand the nature of that shrieking, cold wind. It was the voices of those creatures, or their phantoms, keeping the nightly cycle of their age-long grudge. Turning back the way he had come, he sees their devolved, crocodile-like forms returning to the strange vault in a phantasmic rush, their inhuman forms swarming past him as he forces his way back to the entrance. The great brass door swung shut behind him as he scrambled away. In the renewed darkness, he thinks of how the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred was said to have been torn to pieces by invisible monsters in 730 AD. The explorer compares himself to the image of the dismembered man from the frescoes, the primal men that the creatures so resented for transplanting them in the weakness of their crumbling civilization, whose descendants they still hate. As the explorer makes his way to the surface and back into the open air, he reflects that their vindictive rage is all the stronger because it is largely impotent. There, the story ends. Alright, so this may be one of Lovecraft's favorite stories, but I have mixed feelings about it. Much like many of his stories, I enjoy his diction and his presentation, but I'm not sold on the substance of these creatures. In the story, he describes them as a cross between a crocodile and a seal, roughly humanoid and the size of a small man. While that's a bizarre image, I can't say I find it terrifying or horrifying exactly. Other than that, it's a very short story. Lovecraft indulges in some very poetic descriptions and allusions to try and get across his feelings of awe toward ancient ruins, and I think that part works pretty well. He mixes some quotes from real literature with quotes from Al-Hazred, mentioning fictional locations from his mythos with real and legendary ancient cities. It creates a nice sense of verisimilitude. A lot of that is lost in this adaptation, which was probably unusually difficult because the story relies heavily on the introspection of the narrator. I like the art, it does a good job selling the mysterious setting, but I don't think it manages to fully capture what I liked in the story. It also doesn't really manage to elevate the creatures, which still just aren't that scary or impressive. It still works as a nice little ghost story, and Lovecraft fans will hopefully appreciate it as the first story of the Cthulhu mythos. That'll be all for tonight. I wish you all a very happy Halloween.